I recently made a video about Unit 731, a series of human experiments on Chinese civilians and POWs, which is by far and away one of the worst chapters in human history. But it was one of quite a few atrocious events involving Japan, and a lot of them were quite effectively covered up during the decades immediately after the war. As a result, even in Western countries, we know so much about the conduct of Germany and the horrors of Eastern Europe, but the average person won't know much about what Japan was getting up to in Asia. In fact, the whole story of Unit 731 was only properly released in 2018, and in the 1980s the Japanese Ministry of Education was still censoring the work of historians who were trying to investigate this awful chapter in Japan's past. On top of all that, a lot of comments under the video were saying that to this day, Unit 731 and so many other darker notes in Japanese history are still not covered in the Japanese education system and don't appear in any textbooks. Interestingly, the only comment I've gotten so far which disagreed with what I said about Unit 731 was from a single individual who was, predictably, Japanese. Now, I'm not out to bash Japan here. I really like modern Japan, and I go there as often as I can. But all of this did make me wonder, what do Japanese students actually learn about World War II? Well, to answer that, I did some digging, and I'm sorry to say, it's complicated. In Japan's education system, the government isn't actually allowed to write and/or publish any textbooks on history at all, since that's exactly what happened during the lead up to World War II, and Japan doesn't want that happening again. So instead, Japan's schools receive textbooks from private companies that write and publish them. However, all of these school textbooks need to be reviewed and approved by the Japanese Ministry of Education before they can actually get onto the school bookshelves. And oftentimes, the publishers and the Ministry of Education don't see eye to eye. So much, in fact, that there is an entire Wikipedia page dedicated to Japanese history textbook controversies, which shows the basically never-ending back and forth between historians and the Japanese government on what can and cannot be printed. I read through this wiki, but I really wasn't able to get much info on the specifics of what was actually being taught. So, after that, I read some articles comparing historical education in the US and historical education in Japan. And even then, I was no closer to having some solid info for you. So I just bit the bullet and I bought this, a Japanese high school textbook on history. Now, I should mention that as an ex-history teacher, a textbook is not the be-all and end-all of what kids learn. And although there's usually a set curriculum, the details are really down to the individual teacher. But since we can't actually go to Japan and sit through some classes, this will have to do. It's from Yamakawa Shupansha, which is the most popular publisher of high school history textbooks in Japan, and luckily, the only one I could find that also had an English translation by the original publishers. It was also printed in 2024, which means it's probably found its way onto some desks by now. So, what are the kids learning? Well, I've taken the pleasure of reading it for you, and the best summary I can make is that it's okay. In fact, the main gripe I have with this book is that it's really boring. And if this is a reflection of the other Japanese textbooks on history, then I can understand why it's not a terribly popular topic there. All of the information is quite abstract, and it feels more like a list of detached events rather than any points building to some greater historical narrative. And I think that's on purpose, since the only real narrative that can be painted from the Japanese perspective is one of moral failure and military defeat. The whole thing lacks detail, and at times it does seem purposefully vague, so much so that it can actually get a bit confusing. There were moments when I was reading about how the war started that I wasn't sure whether or not it had actually begun yet, until there was a casual mention of Pearl Harbor and then the hostilities becoming official. That said though, the textbook isn't wrong, there's just some really compelling parts of the story that are missing, and although that's not necessarily a bad thing, I think educators do have a responsibility to get children engaged with the past, and moreover, a chance to showcase just how bad things can get when we ignore the lessons. And the only reason that this isn't done here is, as I said, to save face. We're guilty of this too, by the way, at least in the UK, where we really drive home the human cost of the Atlantic slave trade and Britain's participation in that awful part of history. And it was awful, and Britain did play a part in it. But then we almost completely skip over the role of Britain in the abolition of slavery through a massive religiously motivated anti-slavery movement and a ban on the slave trade enforced by the Royal Navy. But anyway, back to Japan. So, after reading through the textbook's chapters on the Second World War, I decided to just go back and start again, and this time I would try and highlight all of the admissions of misconduct during World War II to see what I could find and what was missing. Here's what I could find. They completely skipped over the Nanjing massacre, where 200,000 to 300,000 people were completely annihilated, and instead they just described the whole affair as a moment where Japan gained possession of Nanjing. There's also no mention at all of the use of comfort women, which, if you didn't know, is exactly what it sounds like, taking Korean and Chinese girls captive and forcing them to service enormous numbers of soldiers. No mention of the Bataan Death March, nor any of the other massacres in Southeast Asia, and there were quite a few to choose from. And lastly, there's no real mention of the torture or execution of Allied POWs, nor even a nod to the kamikaze tactics that were used during the desperate final moments of the war. In the entire period between 1931 and 1945, all I could find was 3 explicit admissions of misconduct. First, an event in 1943 where there was a forced mobilization of labor, a very polite way of saying enslavement, to construct railways in Burma. No more detail than that. Secondly, and to quote directly, in Singapore and Malaysia in particular, there were incidents of the Japanese military killing large numbers of Chinese residents on suspicion of anti-Japanese activities. Again, nothing more than that. No individual examples or any numbers given. But then finally, we have a short sentence in which the Japanese army launched an operation against the anti-Japanese guerrillas, which, quote, inflicted a great deal of destruction upon the civilian population. And on this last one, we're in luck because there's actually a footnote attached to this line, which mentions Unit 731 and tells us that poison gas was used in China and research on these weapons under Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, who led a special unit called 731, which was established to conduct research on biological warfare and performed experiments on Chinese and Soviet prisoners. Now, this is actually the only passage we get that comes anywhere near to actual details, but it's worth bearing in mind that this is just a footnote, so a student would have to actually flip the pages to the relevant footnote, find it, and then read it, which most students, in my experience, are unlikely to do. Only the really curious go that far, and they usually are clued up from other sources anyway. It goes on like this the whole way through, to be honest, treating the whole of World War II with this vague and detached language. Well, that is until we get to the US bombing campaign on the Japanese homeland, which is where we finally get some actual details on how things went down, when the book tells us that as a result of the air raids, 100,000 people burned to death in a single night. Japan suffered losses of approximately 2,210,000 homes to fire, 260,000 dead, 420,000 injured, and the destruction of major production facilities. So yes, they actually can give us some detail when they want to. Now, I actually don't blame Yamakawa, the publishers, for this, because they've got their hands tied by what the Japanese Ministry of Education will and won't actually let them publish. And this back and forth has been going on for a while. In fact, you should know that Yamakawa are considered to be on the more accurate side of things within the Japanese history education space. In the early 2000s, a more nationalist-approved textbook by the Japanese Society for History Textbook Reform sparked a backlash domestically and internationally. Yamakawa's history books were often cited as counter-examples that more accurately and responsibly portrayed the past. So, even if they're not mentioning things properly, or they're not mentioning them with sufficient detail to actually drive home the significance, at least they're kind of trying. Well, I think they're trying. They may just be doing the bare minimum to spark more international backlash. So, is World War II taught accurately in Japan? Kinda? The textbook itself doesn't say anything that's categorically wrong, but sometimes it misses out some important details, which make the story of the Second World War a bit incomplete and ultimately fails to drive home the lessons of the past.